Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are doing the sixth in our six-part series about the Genealogical Proof Standard. Today we're going to be talking about conclusions in your genealogy research. So we'll do a quick review of the previous 4 steps of the Genealogical Proof Standard, and then we'll talk about how to write conclusions that support the research that you're doing in your family history. Let's go ahead and dive in. With just a review of where all this information comes from. So this information comes from Genealogical Standards, which is published by the Board for Certification of Genealogists. They just recently this year published a 50th anniversary edition. And it's not a very big book, it's just a little booklet, but it goes through each of the proof standards, but it also includes some parts and pieces to it as well. So if you want to get your hand on that book, you're going to need to do that soon, okay? Now, let's just review the 5 parts of the Genealogical Proof Standard. Today we're talking about the 5th and final one. If you haven't watched the previous videos, I would encourage you to do that. They're out on our YouTube channel. I will have them all in their own playlist later today so that you can see them all in order. The first standard is a reasonably exhaustive search. The second is a complete and accurate citation of your sources. The third is an analysis and correlation of the collected information. The fourth is a resolution of conflicting evidence. And the 5th is a soundly reasoned, coherently written conclusion. And I love that those 2 phrases are included. It's soundly reasoned and coherently written. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we do, let me just say, as we wrap up this series about the Genealogical Proof Standard, one of the things that I have learned as I have put these together and kind of taken my own research to the next level, is that if you follow these steps, by the time you get to this last step, all the work is done. It's just a matter of tying it all up. And so let's talk about what that means. From the BCG website, this is how they define a soundly reasoned, coherently written conclusion. It eliminates the possibility that the conclusion is based on bias, preconception, or inadequate appreciation of the evidence. And, this is key, it explains how the evidence led to the conclusion. Sometimes we can present evidence to people, and if they don't have the same eyes we have, they may come to a different conclusion. And so we use the evidence then and write how that evidence led to the conclusion that we came to. So let's talk about conclusions for just a minute. What is a conclusion? Well, in order to answer that, it's important to know what your research question was to begin with. In genealogy, what we're always trying to establish is identity. And identity is determined by names, events, and relationships. Those 3 things in concert in a person's life prove the identity of that person. So let me give you an example. I could have someone with the same name, born at the same time, living in the same place. And I could have 2 or 3 of those people, right? So I've used my Daniel Jones example before. I have 3 cousins. Their names are all Daniel Jones. They were all born within a year of each other, and they were all living in Hawkins County, Tennessee. So the names and the events in their life are the same or similar, but it's the relationships in their life that make them unique. And it has to be all their relationships. 2 of those, Daniel Jones married women named Elizabeth. Okay, so it can't just be a spouse's name. It has to be information about their parentage, information about their spouse and children. All of that information in concert proves identity. And so sometimes our pieces or our conclusions are, what was this person's name? When was this person born? Where was this person born? Who are the parents of this person? Those are the individual research questions that we ask along the way where we have to come to some conclusion. And then there's an overarching conclusion about the identity of a person. So, before you sit down to write your conclusions, there are a few additional questions you need to ask yourself. One is, have you followed the Genealogical Proof Standard to this point? Have you done a reasonably exhaustive search? Have you created source citations as you've gone? Have you analyzed the evidence that you've collected? Have you resolved the conflicting evidence that's come up? And we all know there's conflicting evidence. Did you write as you go? So many of you that have spent time with me know that very often, I transcribe every record I find. I do that as I go, in addition to creating the source citations, because it helps me to analyze the information better. And so what that means is by the time I get to the point of writing a conclusion, a lot of that stuff is already written, okay? Are there any weaknesses in your evidence or in your logic? So are there weaknesses in your evidence? Weaknesses in evidence are things like, if I'm looking for the birth date of someone, do I have independent sources, or are those sources all dependent upon each other? So for example, if I've looked at a birth index and a birth record, one of those was created from the other. So they're not really independent sources. Or if I've looked at a family Bible and then a pension file, where that pension file got the evidence from the family Bible, again, not really two unique pieces of evidence. Those are, that's one is dependent upon the other. So when you start to put together your conclusion, you should have a very big awareness of what the weaknesses in your evidence are and where you might need to do further research. Also, are there weaknesses in your logic? And we'll talk a little bit more about assumptions here in just a minute. And then the next question, or the last question that I usually ask myself is there any additional research required? Do I need to kind of cycle back to that reasonably exhaustive search step? It's very easy to try to think linearly, and a lot of us who are drawn to genealogy are very linear thinkers. And so, we think, I want to go through the steps of the GPS one at a time. I want to start with a reasonably exhaustive search and then move on to source citation and then move on. And the reality is that sometimes those steps of the GPS are a lot more fluid than that. Meaning, we may get to the analysis and realize, there's more research to do. Or we may get all the way to the written conclusion portion and realize there's more research to do. And so we might cycle through this GPS process several times before we can even come to a conclusion. Now, when we talk about logic, one of the things that we need to take into consideration are our assumptions. We need to check the assumptions that we're making all along the way. And in the Genealogy Standards Manual from BCG, they have a step number 45, it's called, or standard number 45 rather, it's called assumptions. And they lay out three different kinds of assumptions. One are fundamental assumptions. These are concepts that are generally accepted as true. So for example, nobody is doing anything, there is no life event that is going to occur before someone is born, right? They're not going to have children or get married or move or pay taxes, like buy land. None of that is going to happen before someone is born. That's a fundamental assumption that every one of us can make as we're doing research. So we don't have to explain that in any kind of a written conclusion. Another example of a fundamental assumption is that where people are or where the events in their life occur have to be consistent with the travel technology of their day. So for example, today I could be enumerated on a census, and then by tomorrow I could be having a child on another continent, okay? Technologically, that's possible today. That is not possible 100, 200 years ago, okay? So we have to think about place, we have to think about dates, and we have to just look at what the fundamental assumptions are that we can make that we don't need to explain. Okay. The next kind of assumption are valid assumptions. And valid assumptions are defined as those things that we can, concepts that we can generally accept as true unless they're contradicted. So for example, most women are going to have children between the ages of 13 and 50. Now, are there women who have had children after the age of 50? Yes. Okay, but the valid assumption that we can function under is if they're between the ages of 13 and 50, those are generally the generally accepted childbearing years. If a woman has a child after 50, that becomes an assumption that we have to explain in a written conclusion. We have to explain why we believe that this child is actually hers and not the child of her 20-year-old or 30-year-old daughter. Okay, so valid assumptions are generally accepted as true unless they're contradicted, and then we have to explain the contradiction. Next is going to be unsound assumptions, okay? And unsound assumptions are concepts that may be valid, but can't be accepted without supporting evidence. So for example, let's say you find a man living in a census with his children, and there is no wife or no wife listed. But you discover that the year before the census, he had a wife that died. Okay, so an unsound assumption may be that the widow of that man is the mother of those children. It's possible she is the mother of some or all of those children, but you need supporting evidence to prove that. You cannot make that assumption based on just that amount of evidence. Another example is you find a woman listed on a marriage record, and it lists a name. Last name. An unsound assumption would be that that is her maiden name. Unless you have supporting evidence that shows that that is also the surname of her parents, you need supporting evidence to prove that. That name on that marriage certificate could be the last name of her first husband. Okay, so you need additional evidence to support that assumption. So those are some of the ways in which the assumptions that we make play into this written conclusion. If it's a fundamental assumption, or if it's a valid assumption, then you don't need to explain it in detail. However, if it's a valid assumption that if it falls outside of the valid range, or if it's an unsound assumption, you're going to need to do some explaining or have some supporting evidence to prove that fact. So then we get to the writing portion. And it doesn't have to be long or a lot, right? Sometimes when we talk about writing, some people get really scared away. Sometimes a written summary, it can just be a summary. It can be a statement. Okay, we call it a proof statement as opposed to a proof summary or a proof argument. Okay, proof arguments are sometimes big and long and written, out in Word documents, as opposed to a proof statement that just says John Smith was born in 1827 in New York. Okay, that's a proof statement. So clearly state the question that's to be answered and include your who, what, where, when, and why. Then look through the evidence you've collected to see which pieces of evidence best support your hypothesis. And you're going to want to include all the evidence that you use to come to your conclusion and include the best quality evidence, which means, again, if you've looked at a birth index and an actual birth record, the evidence you're going to want to include in your written summary is that birth record. Okay, the index then just becomes a finding aid. Okay, it was what helped you find the original record. So it becomes inconsequential in that point. Now, if all you have is a birth index and the original record is unavailable or no longer in existence, well, then that birth index is the best evidence that you have. So always include the best quality evidence that you have. Do not omit conflicting evidence. It's really tempting to just take conflicting evidence, things that don't agree with your conclusion, and just ignore them. But what happens when somebody else comes along and finds that conflicting evidence and comes to a different conclusion? Okay, so one of the things that I hope we're doing is that we're trying to climb our own family trees. I hope that we're trying to find our ancestors. And this process helps us do that. It helps ensure that we're looking at our ancestors, not somebody else's. And so what happens is we end up with other people, other family members who come across those same ancestors in their tree. And if we have written up a good conclusion and included the conflicting evidence, then that can stand as evidence for other people. But if we've omitted the conflicting evidence because we didn't like it or we didn't want to pay attention to it or we couldn't explain it, well, then somebody else can come along and contradict our assumptions. And so that's what we're trying to avoid here. The next thing you want to do as you write this information down is to present the evidence in a logical sequence. Okay? This is not always the order in which you uncovered it as you researched. So there are times, for example, where I may find a 1930 census, and then I might find a World War I draft card from 1917, and then I might find a 1920 census, and then I might find a 1900 census. So do you see what's happening? I'm finding things out of order of the life events of this person. But if I was going to write it up, I would put those things in order of the way in which they occurred in this person's life, because that's a more logical sequence. So when you write it up or when you put this information together, put it in some kind of a logical sequence. So there are a couple of ways to do this, and we'll look at some examples here as we wrap up. There are a couple of ways to write your summary. The first one is a simple just summary where you explain your conclusions. And the more complex thing is to create proof arguments and actually publish those. So let's take a look at a couple of people in my tree, and I'll just show you again kind of the process that I use as I write as I go, and then how I record those conclusions. So this is my great-grandmother. As a matter of fact, you can't see it probably, but this tiny little picture up here is her with me as a baby. She died when I was very young, so I don't remember her, but I've heard lots of stories of her, and I have actually gone through and done some research on her life. And so here are all of the records that I have collected that are about her life. Every time I find one of these records, I attach it, and that creates a source citation, and then I can adjust or add or edit that source citation as needed. But I also write as I go. I transcribe every record I find into the notes for a person or for a family. And so here you'll see, this great-grandmother of mine was born in 1884. Now we know there is no 1890 census, it was destroyed, so the first census she's going to show up in is a 1900 census. So I go through, and this is kind of my research process, I go through and I collect all the census records for a person. So here she is in 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930, okay. I have not yet located her in the 1940 census because by the time it came out, I had already moved on to other things. So I do need to do that. I also have included here, we have a family Bible. She had a family Bible. She's a very, 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 very religious woman. And she had a family Bible that is now in the possession of her granddaughter. And I copied this information directly out of the family Bible, what she had written in her own hand about her marriage to my great-grandfather. So here we have names and dates and places, okay? I also here have a couple of additional pieces of information. One is her obituary that was published in the Northwest Arkansas Times in Fayetteville in 1974, and I've transcribed the text of that. I also have information here about where she is buried. I visited there and have taken a picture of the tombstone and have all that information. And then I also have here her Social Security death index listing as additional evidence of her name, her date of birth, her date of death, when and where that card was issued, where she was living at the time. Okay, so all of these are things that I've collected over time, and you can see I've written as I've gone. And so then what are the conclusions that I draw from this information? Well, here I have her name, including her maiden name, in her own hand, okay? I have a birth date in place, I have death dates in places, I have marriage dates in places. All of this information about her identity is wrapped up in this evidence that I have collected. And so one of the ways that I then create the conclusion about that evidence is by actually filling in the blanks on my family tree. I now have her name, including her maiden name, her marriage to my great-grandfather, her birth date in place, her death date in place, her burial date in place, and her marriage date in place. So all of that information has been entered into my tree as a conclusion. Now, there are some people for whom I have not yet done enough research. I don't yet have a conclusion. So, for example, if we look here at her great-grandmother, I only have an approximate birth year in place and only a given name. I have a suspicion about her maiden name, and it's written in my notes, but I haven't entered that yet because I haven't proven that to my satisfaction. And so one of the ways you can record those conclusions is by actually just entering that information into a tree once that research is done. Now, if there had been any conflicting information in any of these records that I collected, down here at the bottom I would probably make a note about how I resolved that conflicting information, because again, we don't want to ignore conflicting evidence. Now, there are some other resources available to you that I just want to share with you in closing. Sometimes it requires a little bit more detail than that. Sometimes the evidence that we use to come to a conclusion is not as simple and direct as a family Bible written in the hand of the person whose life we're researching. Sometimes we use a lot of indirect evidence to prove a relationship between a father and a son, or to prove a birth date or an age, or a lot of times we have to use a lot of complex information, and sometimes that requires more writing. Sometimes in our research, if our research has been done well, we uncover that there are multiple people living in the same place with the same name, and so our written conclusion needs to include information about why we chose that this record pertains to our person and not the other person with the same name. And so that requires a little bit more than just what we could write in the notes or plug into a family tree. And so we write what are called proof arguments. Those proof arguments then can be dropped into a Word document, and that Word document can be attached as a media item in your tree. And so let me just show you some examples here. This is from the BCG website. It's bcgcertification.org. And whether you want to be a certified genealogist or not, you have access to these resources, and they have some fantastic skill-building articles written by some of the best genealogists in the world. They also have some samples of proof arguments and proof summaries that you can look at in order to fashion or model your own research after. So the first article I want to point out here is by Barbara Vines Little, and she wrote an article in the BCG magazine back in 2009 called "It's Not Hard to Write Proof Arguments," and she just beautifully lays out the different kinds of ways in which you can write a proof argument. She talks about the difference between arguments and summaries. She talks about a list-style proof summary, which is what I just showed you in my own tree, where you just list the evidence as you have found it. She talks about narrative-style proof summaries. Then at the bottom of the article, she actually gives you a sample of a proof argument that she has written to prove a particular piece of identity for someone in her research. So again, that's on the BCG website. It's a skill builder. They've got this whole list of skill building things over here. It's Barbara Vines Little, called "It's Not That Hard to Write Proof Arguments." The next two resources I'm going to suggest to you actually come from the same blogger. Michael Haight has a blog called "Planting the Seeds, Genealogy as a Profession," and he's done a whole series of blog posts in the last few years about the Genealogical Proof Standard. And he does have a couple of articles specifically about this final step of the GPS, this writing of conclusions. The first one is called "What is a Conclusion?" And so when you get to his blog, it's michaelhaight.wordpress.com. If you just do a search for conclusion, you should pull up this blog post. It's "What is a Conclusion?" where he talks about how we define a conclusion, some additional questions we should ask ourselves in that process. And then he has a post written shortly after that one called "Simple and Complex Genealogical Conclusions," where he talks about the difference between, and he actually provides this gorgeous little table here about how to make simple conclusions based on the evidence that we've uncovered, and how sometimes those conclusions might be a little bit more complex and how we have to handle those. So really excellent, again, excellent resources from some of the top genealogists available out there just to help you understand the different ways you can write your conclusions. Now, with all of that said, I just hope that you don't feel too overwhelmed by this. The key is not to do it perfectly and extensively and every single time and to write publishable material. The idea is just to get you to write something, right? Transcribe your sources. Start there. Look at the evidence that you're collecting and see if you could write out a sentence or two about why in one record this person goes by one name and in another record they go by another name, but you still think it's the same person. Or, why it is that the death certificate lists these as the parents, but the birth record lists these as the parents, and why you think those are the same person. Okay, so get used to explaining or defending your conclusions, and sometimes it just just takes a sentence or two. So just be able to write that. Again, my hope for you always is that you're climbing your own family tree, not someone else's. And all of this is designed just to help you make sure that you're uncovering your own ancestors and not latching on to somebody else's. Hopefully that has been useful information for you. If you're watching this live, I will be on the chat in just a few minutes to answer any additional questions you might have. If you're watching an archived version of this on our YouTube channel, please feel free to leave a comment below the video. We do monitor those and will respond as necessary. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.